giant orange records.
Dylan's worst album, Ain't So Bad. You may be wondering, what is Bob Dylan's worst album, and why would I want to listen to it? Well, it's alright, Ma, if you haven't heard this one in a while. We're not going to talk about most of his 80s albums, because the live bootlegs are where it's at if you want to skip the 80s overproduction that never belonged anywhere near a Dylan record. And we're not going to mention Triplicate, the triple album of Sinatra covers. We're going to set the Wayback Machine to the new morning of Dylan's second decade of being one of the biggest music stars on this fair planet. We're talking about the first real shocker that he ever put out. The year was 1970, and Bob Dylan was tired of being called the voice of a generation. He went full-on country in 1969 with the wonderful Nashville Skyline, but his next detour of reinvention hit the music press and fans with the hard rain that finally fell when he dropped the double album bomb of Self-Portrait. Up to this point, we'd never heard his love of the Everly Brothers so clearly, and looking back on what I find to be a very enjoyable but also very mellow country folk record, we can see how Dylan just showed us another side of Americana, a genre he accidentally invented on his first three Going Electric albums of Bring It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde. Those three are some of the most important rock and roll albums ever made, where we still have amphetamine Dylan cramming all those syllables into 32 verses faster than you can say Subterranean Homesick Blues or Ballad of a Thin Man, rapping like you were a beatnik poet on a black and white New York City rooftop, 1958. But what he also did was mix the music of Atlantic Records era Ray Charles with a full rhythm and blues band that was cooking up much faster rock and roll licks like a hot skillet on a gas stove. And that was great and all, but Dylan knew he couldn't keep doing that forever. So he took that same skillet to a cowboy campfire with more coals and less flames, but he had to figure out a way to get there. So he might have faked a motorcycle crash to take time off of touring and come back with the surprisingly stripped-back seriousness of John Wesley Harding before finding his way back to that Nashville Skyline for a short, upbeat, and fun record where Dylan supposedly stopped smoking cigarettes and started singing like Caruso with his newfound voice, literally and figuratively. This was about 10 Minnesota cornfields removed from the screaming of 1965's top hit Like a Rolling Stone. What Self-Portrait accomplished was putting a lot of distance between 1965 and 1970. To really drive this point home, this album gives us a live version of Like a Rolling Stone from his 1969 concert at the Isle of Wight Festival. This is a way more laid-back take. All the tired horses in the sun, how am I supposed to get any writing done, is asked in every way it can be sung over the course of 3 minutes as the opening track. Gone are the Dylan songs with 19 verses before you get to a chorus. This is all chorus all the way through, and it's catchy. This melody will lasso your memory for days after hearing it. And with that, we are given a mostly acoustic take on Americana music. If any Americana band released an album like this today, everybody would eat it up. We're also given 2 Everly Brothers covers, a Gordon Lightfoot cover, a Simon and Garfunkel cover, Blue Moon, and folk and country songs that are so obscure to rock and roll fans that only Dylan and Woody Guthrie themselves know whose front porch these songs came from. And amid all the covers, Dylan gives us a live version of the mighty Quinn the Eskimo, just to keep things interesting, since that was one of his songs that was a hit for Manfred Mann. Self-Portrait is also the first time Dylan's version was released officially, though it may have been bootleg before that. Another reason Dylan may have released what seems to be such an unusual album is that he was being bootlegged heavily at that time, mostly with what became known as the basement tapes or the Great White Wonder. Dylan, presumably an audiophile, claims to have hated the low quality of his bootlegs. I'd always liked a handful of songs off this album, Self-Portrait, but overall I just didn't really get it. I like Nashville Skyline and New Morning much better, but I'm more of a rock and country fan than I am an Americana folk fan. But what really turned this around for me was the 2013 bootleg series called Another Self-Portrait, which ties together the whole Dylan era of 1969 through 1971 and shows a theme emerging with all the material he recorded in that era. And the bootleg series also proves that the material Dylan didn't release is better than what most artists at that time were releasing, or any time for that matter. This guy just had his finger on the creative pulse and never let up, not even for what many considered his worst album at the time. So what does it all mean? It was shocking then, but it's not so shocking now. Perhaps the entire culture has shifted and the general population doesn't really care what musicians are doing so much these days, but they sure put a lot of stake in every album from a major artist back in the late 60s and the early 70s. While this may never be my favorite Dylan album, it certainly is a lot more enjoyable than the hogwash it was initially considered to be. And the legacy lived on. This album is as much, if not more, of a hippie-friendly album for Dylan. It's not too far removed from the tonalities of any Grateful Dead record of the era, minus all the jamming. Only 2 songs here break the 5-minute mark, but most are in the 2 to 3 minute range, showing us once more that Dylan was going in a more traditional folk and pop song direction than he'd been doing throughout most of his 60s albums. And all of his 60s album had songs that got up there in length until Nashville Skyline. So don't knock it before you try it, but maybe don't also make this the first album you put on if you're having a party on Saturday night. Or perhaps more importantly than the music, Dylan wanted to show off his painting skills on the album cover. I suppose we will never know, and maybe it's better that way.